Those who organized, trained the men at the bases, and kept things going obtained no recognition if they were no longer with the Grand Army or had not taken part in such and such a battle. No commanding officer was ever brought to book for the losses occasioned by his negligence, his lack of order and discipline, even if 2/3 of his force had been wasted from these causes. If he led a gallant charge at the head of the 100 men left him on the day of battle, he obtained whatever he desired, and nothing was given to the brave lieutenant colonel who, after fighting his 20 campaigns, was back in the depot, organizing and drilling the detachments that were to reinforce the army. He was forgotten because he had had no chance of contributing any brilliant deeds to the successful affair of the moment. Far be it from me to say that the emperor did not reward the old soldiers. There are too many instances to prove, on the contrary, that they were the objects of his solicitude when they remained with the army or were invalided out, but let them remain in the depot, even in the interests of the service, and they could obtain no promotion until they returned to the fighting line. Undoubtedly, the system had the advantage of making all officers anxious to get back to the front, but it was really detrimental to the service and to the best officers as well, for the depots were only given to the most capable men. Any honest investigator who would compare the conditions of his corps at the beginning of the campaign with its state at the end, seeking the cause of loss and wastage, would certainly find that it was not the enemy's guns which had done the most damage to our cavalry. The fine state in which some corps were maintained to the very last moment compared to the disorder and destruction suffered by others that had been seen no longer service, proves that our greatest foe was lack of discipline, and the disorders that followed in its train originated in the negligence of the commanding officers. For his headquarters, the emperor had altogether 715 saddle and draw horses in Russia to draw the wagons loaded with provisions of all kinds, as well as a great outfit of tents. As his headquarters were always the last to arrive, and that invariably in a place already laid waste because the whole army had already passed by, it was necessary to carry everything with us or seek what we needed from a distance. It must also be observed that the general services supply did not furnish in all 1,000 pounds of bread, 100 trusses of hay, nor a particle of oats to the emperor's household throughout the campaign. I have, therefore, had experience of what can be done by method and care in supplementing the provender, both in kind and quantity. All persons attached to headquarters were in the same plight. But as none had more than a few horses, it was much easier for them to find and provide fodder. It is also an admitted fact that the mounts of the emperor and his suite made much longer and faster rides than other horses. Yet, on reaching Vilna on December 8th, during the retreat, only 80 horses had been lost out of the 715 with which we had started the campaign. I enter into these particulars in order to answer in advance all the fables that have been told and that will yet be told as to the effects of the cold, the lack of provisions, and so forth. During the retreat, horses fell and lay by the roadside chiefly because they were not properly shod to keep their footing on ice, and once down and vainly having attempted to rise, they ended by lying where they fell and were cut up for food before they were even dead. With proper shoeing and the exercise of a little care, the greater number would certainly have been saved. Before leaving the subject of Moscow, it is essential that I should say something about its administration. The Duke of Treviso had been charged with the government of the city, and Monsieur de Lesseps, formerly Consul General of Petersburg, had been placed at the head of the administration. This estimable gentleman was on his way back to Paris with his wife and 8 children when a courier caught him up as he was disembarking at Danzig and handed him imperative orders to proceed at once to the imperial headquarters, then at the gates of Moscow. Despite his urgent request to be excused from all duties, after a week the emperor appointed him intendant. This excellent man did all he could. Like a true governor, he put a stop to many evils. Among them, the issue of forged papers, the loss of many billions by pillage, and the destruction of such archives as had been saved from the fire. It was the honorable and worthy Lesseps who raised more opposition than anyone else to the proclamation for the liberation of the serfs. It was he who collected, sheltered, nourished, and in fact saved quite a number of unfortunate men, women, and children whose houses had been burned and who were wandering like ghosts among the ruins of the capital. On this occasion, he showed that he had not forgotten the 30 years' hospitality he had met with in Russia. I was an eyewitness of this estimable man's efforts. He often confided in me his disappointments and all the sorrow that so much distressed him. It is only right that I should render justice to the honorable sentiments that have been his invariable guide. The emperor had prepared a proclamation to give the serfs their freedom. This was early in October. Some dregs of the lowest classes of society and a few firebrands, German artisans who made themselves the mouthpiece for these people and egged them on, had raised an outcry and demanded that this should be done. These same men had persuaded the emperor to begin the proclamation by announcing that hopes of freedom were germinating in every peasant's head, that thereafter, instead of finding himself surrounded by enemies, the emperor would have millions of auxiliaries. Yet was not this measure radically opposed to his acknowledged principles? He felt, and some time later observed to me, that the prejudice and fanaticism excited against us in the minds of the populace would prove a great obstacle, for some time at least, and that consequently he would have to bear all the odium of that measure without reaping any of the benefits. The disorder and pillage which inevitably followed our forced marches had caused the initial damage and alienated the peasants. The fires that had been so skillfully started, for which the peasants blamed the French, the different language, the crusade preached against us by the Russian clergy, all had combined to make that superstitious folk regard us as barbarians who had come to overturn their altars, steal their goods, ravage their women and children, lead them into captivity. And so they fled from us as from wild beasts. It would have taken time to reestablish our relations with the inhabitants. You have to confer before you can agree. As matters stood, there was no one to confer with. The Russian government had been wise to send away the inhabitants before the French arrived. In those grave circumstances, now it can be said, the Russians lacked neither talent nor forethought. This being the case, a proclamation which, apart from anything else, was not in accordance with the emperor's views, could have served no purpose, for it would have had no effect and would have imparted to the war a revolutionary character, which would have been highly unseemly in a monarch with reason, prided himself on having restored social order to Europe. So the preparation of this proclamation was merely a threat. It deceived nobody who really knew the emperor. It was one of those countless gestures he made to see if a threat would produce any effect. He wished, if possible, to intimidate. It was some of that avenging thunder of his, that heat lightning which never struck. He left nothing untried to bring about the negotiations he desired. But this proclamation was not a device that entered into his political scheme, although he spoke as if it were a definite project. One day the emperor even said to me, "Like you, Lesseps is against emancipation. Yet there are some who know as much about the Russians as you, who think differently. You're opposed to it because it would not be playing fair with your friend Alexander. But those fires were not fair either. They would fully justify reprisals. Otherwise, I think exactly as you do about this emancipation. It is impossible to tell where such a measure would lead up to the present, except that Alexander has burned his towns to prevent us from occupying them. We have played the game with each other. There have been no offensive proclamations, no insults. He is wrong not to come to terms. Now that our duel is over, we should soon be in agreement and remain the best of friends."